Coming up, welcome to the NFL playoffs for everybody, but obviously not the New York Football Giants. We take a look at veteran quarterbacks that could be on the market after this offseason. We take a look at some of the backups that maybe could be bridge options for the New York Football Giants. And what is going on in Minnesota with Daniel Jones? Should the Giants fans be starting to feel a lump in their throat? We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Arbuckle, over there, Andrew Mackwitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We're talking NFL playoff football. And Andy, while the Giants aren't in it, that's kind of a saving grace because we don't have to feel anything about nerves or tension or, sure, they made the playoffs, but they got absolutely trounced. No, you get to sit back as a football fan and just enjoy these games over the course of this playoff weekend.
That's kind of like saying, it's better that we're not in Hawaii right now, Adam, because the flight is really long. The UV rays are strong this time of year. Who knows what the current and the riptide is going on? Like, it's just better to be sitting here in 0-degree weather in New York and New Jersey, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you're welcome, fam. That's why we didn't go on that vacation this season. And guess what? We may not take any going forward either. The super wild card weekend now. First time that the NFL is also throwing a playoff game onto Monday night. We'll probably talk about that on Monday in terms of, does that feel like you need to do that? What the NFL, you greedy SOBs, always have to extend yourself into more and more spaces. But before we get into anything, there's Daniel Jones conversation I want to get to. There's two things that are outside of our discussion around the Giants and potential QBs. One is I wanted to ask you, did you see the way that Dan Campbell talked about Aaron Glenn when he was asked about him and his interviewing processes and whether or not he thinks he's deserving of a head coaching job?
I did not, but I can only imagine that Dan Campbell is like the most emotional heart on your sleeve guy, right?
Well, and it wasn't anything crazy. Like, he didn't say, this guy will eat your kneecaps or, your whatever, all kinds of your limbs. But the way that he talked about it, and head coaches are always speaking glowingly about their staff. But he said, like, he basically at the end of it concluded with, yeah, if nobody wants him, I'll gladly have him back here. But he's incredibly deserving of a head coaching job. And he went as far as to say he understands the defense, obviously. He motivates that side of the football, but he also understands the offensive side. He understands the scheme. He understands how to do things at a high level beyond just the X's and O's. It was just such a glowing review. And I know it's always like the grass is greener, or you just want the sensation of what it's like. When you hear guys get talked about like that, I'm like, you should have fired these guys. We should be talking about interviewing Aaron Glenn right now. We should be talking about being in the mix for one of these coaches. We'll see how it all pans out. But Aaron Glenn has really built himself up. And a lot of people regard the fact of being in Detroit for the reclamation of that franchise as being a really strong talking point for understanding how to start maybe from the bottom with a franchise and help it grow.
Yeah, I mean, Aaron Glenn is one of those guys that the Giants would absolutely have to interview if they decided not to bring back Brian Daboll. It's funny, the approach that people can have about coordinators getting head coaching opportunities or interviews. You see Josh Allen was up on the stage and they're like, can you talk a little bit about how important Joe Brady has been to your progression this year? Did you hear what Josh Allen said about Joe Brady?
Oh, yeah. He's terrible.
He's terrible.
Really
He doesn't contribute anything. Like, you definitely don't want him. There's two ways to go about it. It's like you have Dan Campbell, who's like glowing review, and then you have Josh Allen being like, please don't take him away from me. Please don't do that. I don't want that. It is funny though that all these coaches are now going around and taking their head coaching interviews. And to your point, it is like the hot names around there. You're like, man, what would the Giants look like if they had a Ben Johnson or an Aaron Glenn or someone that is getting all the interviews a la Mike Vrabel and others?
Of course. That being the case, the other stuff that's coming out here, which we won't find out maybe until Monday, could be something sexy to have a conversation. But as it pertains to the New York Football Giants, one Daniel Jones obviously was elevated, signed to the active roster for the Minnesota Vikings. That made it possible. I think we made reference to this, or you framed it as, this is how smart organizations do things. You sign him to the active roster, you set yourself up for a compensatory draft pick if he signs elsewhere this offseason. But now we're hearing that the Vikings, when they go ahead and ask Kevin O'Connell about, who's going to be your number two? And Mullins has been there all season long. He again declined to say if Mullins or Jones would be Darnold, back up on Monday night against the LA Rams. Definitely has progressed, O'Connell said about Jones. He's gotten a lot of really good work in both running the scout team and then also just extra work here and there where he can with quarterbacks coach Josh McCown. Some Giants fans or people are saying, good Lord, prepare for the sky to fall if XYZ occurs here, right? I look at it as, yeah, that's the medicine you get. If for any reason, you never want to see someone get hurt, but if for any reason Sam Darnold were to get hurt, even miss a series, even miss 4 plays, if Daniel Jones steps onto the field in an NFL playoff game, let alone a Minnesota Vikings uniform, ironically, and perform and throws one good pass, this is what you get when you make decisions that kind of feel like it's a swirl of random logic and maybe not thought out process. Guess what? You may find yourself watching your former 6th overall pick, supposed franchise quarterback, take the field for a team that has high expectations entering the playoffs.
Would you be surprised if Daniel Jones played well if anything happened to Sam Darnold?
You know what? It's funny because after everything that's gone on, the way we've talked about it, no, I wouldn't be surprised at all. And it's very simple reason why is because he won't be wearing a Giants uniform. And I can say that about a lot of players, that if you're not wearing a Giants uniform, the likelihood that you can be successful as an NFL player increases by probably 20 to 30%.
Yeah, Adam, I totally agree with you. If he had to step in at any moment, I feel like he could move the ball down the field for the Minnesota Vikings. Like you and I both feel that way. And Kevin O'Connell looks at him and says, there's no baggage with me. There's no media scrutiny. Yep. You weren't the 6th overall pick. You decided to come here. We wanted you here. We both made this decision together. We're going to ease you in. There's no pressure at all. And listen, we haven't even had you on the active roster. You've been able to learn the playbook and train off to the side. No one said anything about you. Like this situation, especially with this coach, to me is like, I would not be surprised if Daniel Jones ends up playing well if he was called upon in this situation.
So we'll get into that a little bit more as we work our way towards Monday, obviously. But over the course of this weekend, we're going to see a litany of not only high-level talent when it comes to QB positions, but guys that are going to be potentially on the market this offseason. And we've heard now, the Giants, John Mara says, my patience is thin. This is win now time. Okay, so how are the Giants going to construct their QB room? Even if you believe they 100% are going to draft a quarterback, which, by the way, quick little side note here. I watched the Penn State game last night. Am I supposed to be impressed by this kid, Andrew? Am I supposed to think that this kid is going to declare for this NFL draft? And he lost, so apparently that was a big contingent. If he had won, maybe. But they lose that game. If he had gone to the draft, they were talking about how he's going to skyrocket up and be in contention for the number 1 quarterback taken in the draft, which makes really weird sense to me. I don't follow the college game a ton, but you go over on Draft Buzz, he's like the 7th rated quarterback in next year's draft class. I could not figure out this weird swirl of irrational hype that seemed to bubble up in the last 4 days, shy of, hey, guess what? We got a bowl game happening here, semifinals for college football. Let's get a narrative going. I'm not knocking the kid, but there was nothing that I watched in that game where I said, oh, actually, the one thing I noticed was, yeah, I see some familiar things that this quarterback's going to have to work on that we had a quarterback who could never quite figure those out over 6 years.
See, I wasn't overreacting to all this with all what was happening. Adam, what my spider senses, I put on my tinfoil hat. I honestly just think that like his NIL representatives were like, he could go. He could go as high as top 10. So if he should come back, you should pay him accordingly. Like, to me, it just felt like that was the thing. Now, he has the NFL traits in terms of size, arm talent. Even on the interception that he threw at the end, you can literally see he went through his progression, was like, nope, this isn't open. Nope, this isn't open. And he
didn't go through that progression on that interception in the touchdown in the first half when it got called back from the penalty for defensive holding, where he just kind of stared and then lobbed it short. And he was like, by the way, I'm not going to kid you, but the old tap on the chest, my bad. Yeah, I mean, you lobbed it 6 yards short. It did feel like a you bad, but
he reminds me a little bit, and this is going to be a strange name to compare him to, but Jake Locker, the Washington quarterback from like 10 years ago that got like inexplicably drafted like number 7th overall and then completely flamed out in the NFL. And they were like, but his traits are unbelievable. It just reminds me of that. Honestly, watching that game and watching Abdul Carter play on the defensive side of the ball for Penn State, I was like, Now that looks like an NFL type prospect. And to me, he's a guy that's going to go top 10 in the NFL draft. You should be focused on the defensive side of the ball if you're the Giants, not necessarily at the QB position.
100%. So we'll continue that conversation into the offseason with all the prospects that are there and what the Giants could or could not do. Today's not going to be about the rookie class coming out and whether or not the Giants go in that direction or who they take, because no matter what they do when it comes to the draft at the QB spot, they still have to figure out who is the veteran, who helps us win now, who helps us coach up that player that we're potentially going to take with a third overall pick. Let's get into that conversation from Sam Darnold, maybe a little bit of Russell Wilson action, and even our old friend Matthew Stafford out in LA. We'll get into that all here coming up in just one moment. All right, Andy, big slate of games, obviously, NFL playoff football. We don't really have to focus too much on the Houston Texans, the Baltimore Ravens, or by the way, the LA Chargers for that matter. Unless, I don't know, maybe you want to get rid of Justin Herbert. We'll have a conversation. We're willing to discuss it. But Pittsburgh on Saturday to kick off in these playoffs, the late game, 8 p.m., Russell Wilson is there, and we're going to include this kind of in this top tier. There are 4 guys that are considered from the outside looking in to be the top tier guys. And we'd say it's Russell Wilson, obviously. You're going to put a player like Sam Darnold into that category. And it seems like, Andy, that Justin Fields is being included in that list of top bridge quarterback prospects for the Giants to consider.
Yeah, it's interesting to see. Each of them has their own dynamic in terms of what they could bring to the table. Adam, I'll start with Sam Darnold. I just think that is an open and shut conversation where it's like, I believe at the very least, the Minnesota Vikings would franchise tag Sam Darnold if they couldn't come to a long-term agreement. Obviously, he was thriving in Kevin O'Connell's system. It looks great. They were the last game of the season away from having the 1 seed. He's been in the MVP conversation. It would be kind of, I'll put it this way. If the Minnesota Vikings let him out of the building, that would surprise me, and it would make me highly suspicious if you were the team wanting to give him $50 million a year.
When you look at him, like, it's not comparable to Daniel Jones a couple years ago when he goes to the playoffs, because the record for the Vikings, right? And obviously throws for 4,300 yards. Sam Darnold plays all 17 games. You mentioned 66 completion percentage and ends up giving you 35 touchdowns to 12 interceptions. So make no mistake about it. This is not the Daniel Jones playoff season. And, what should we do with him? But do you think that they're like, the only way I can see him going to market is the Minnesota Vikings looking and saying, what we don't want to do is overcommit on a guy. The franchise tag is fine. You lock him up. You have JJ. We'll talk about him a little bit later here. But the idea of there's no world where if Darnold goes to market, I think there are a handful of teams that are ready to pay him $45-50 million AAV, right? So that's the difference here. Whereas we talked about, hey, if you let Jones go to the market, maybe you could have gotten him for $25 million instead of $40 million, right? Darnold's going to have a market here. And that's where I think the conversation about what Minnesota will do, I agree with you. Well, at worst, we'll tag him. At worst, we'll have a conversation about what it could look like 2 years from now and how we think about our roster. But when you've had success, unless they have some player up their sleeve that they want to go get and believe we need to get above Sam Darnold in terms of talent level, do you think anything Darnold does in this playoff game could influence the way the Vikings handle him this offseason?
I do think that it's not about wins or losses, but it's making sure that the moment isn't
the proverbial
too big.
field.
Yeah, like it's just how he plays on the field. If he looks like the moment isn't too big, if he plays relatively well, I think that potentially pushes the organization to say, let's lock him up long term. We've seen everything we need to see. He checks all the boxes for us. He had regular season success. He's coachable. The team likes him. He's now winning playoff games. Like, to me, if that happens, then you look to more of a long-term thing. If he ends up having a horrible game, you may turn around and say, do we want to get into the Daniel Jones situation that the Giants were just in? Do we maybe just franchise tag him like the Giants should have done potentially with Daniel Jones and say, let's just see it one more time before we give you top of the market money? I do think if they win, the organization should be thinking like, what other boxes would he need to check to be our future QB?
Russell Wilson, Pittsburgh, they bring him in. We're going to talk about Justin Fields here too. Russell Wilson starts 11 games. He goes 64 completion percentage. He gives you 16 up, 5 down. But this is a team that lost a lot of football games down the stretch and kind of is falling into the playoffs. How much about that do you think, from the Giants standpoint, if we're talking about let's just ballpark it at 2 years, 60 for Russell Wilson's services in the offseason. Do you think that he's falling victim to the fact that, remember, were the Steelers expected to make the playoffs this year? Were they expected to win 10 games this season? Like, they overshot expectations in so many ways that now all of a sudden, I don't know, like, is it that dissimilar to Minnesota, where if you're Pittsburgh, you're just automatically like, see you later, Russell, have fun, bye-bye, we'll figure out our next QB thing. I know that he didn't play nearly to the level that Darnold did, but again, maybe Pittsburgh's difference here is like, we're kind of a franchise that always feels confident about figuring it out, that we don't need to feel like we overextend ourselves on a veteran who came in, played pretty well for us, but by no means is someone we maybe want to be committed to for 2 more years.
Yeah, well, listen, I don't think the Giants should be interested at $30 million a year.
Let's also have
Russell
that.
Wilson.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Also, I'm out
I
on the
just
$30 million AAV Wilson.
Yeah, he was attractive this season. It's why he had so many potential suitors, because of the offset money that the Denver Broncos were basically paying. So you could get him for pennies on the dollar. That's potentially going to happen with a guy like Kirk Cousins if the Atlanta Falcons decide to move on from him. That seems more in line. Russell Wilson making $30 million a year. He's playing fine. He is great in Pittsburgh because Pittsburgh has an identity, and their identity is we play very good defensive football. Like, we hang our hat playing defense. We need a quarterback that can keep us in games, and our defense will win football games for us. The Giants are in a completely different situation where they're like, we are still looking for our identity. And does Russell Wilson give you any different identity as a Giant paying him $30 million? I would suggest that he doesn't. And so at the price point, based on what he could bring to the Giants, I just would not be in on Russell Wilson, even though I've been a very big fan of him over the last 10 years.
The interesting thing is too, is this demand from Giants ownership that this needs to be a good year. This needs to be a winning football season. And you can make the case that Russell Wilson gives you a chance maybe to do that to some extent. But it's what makes it interesting about the next guy, which is also in Pittsburgh, considered. Now, we're including him in the top tier. There's one more player that we want to get to. We've talked about before that would require a little more mechanics to acquire. But Justin Fields, who right now, like the AAV, I ended up putting it at like 2 for 30. Like, I'm going at least 15 million a year, probably. It's been under 10 listed on like Spot Track, but I just don't, there's just no way. If you're getting an abridged quarterback, I think he's of enough status that you're not going to get the Drew Lock $5 million treatment here. But you and I both have a really hard time understanding where the hype is coming from when it comes to Justin Fields, because there's his time in Chicago. Okay, you can encapsulate that a certain way because Chicago's dysfunctional. And then he comes to Pittsburgh. And listen, at the end of the day, he had the starting job when Wilson went down with injury. And the bottom line is Mike Tomlin and the Pittsburgh Steelers said he played pretty well, but we are not hesitating to go back to Russell Wilson. That to me tells you everything in terms of what are you getting in this player if you bring him in? Can you expect to put him out there and get winning football consistently week over week?
My simple thing on Justin Fields is, what would you say is his weakness, Adam?
You know what? And I don't know if this is the kind of answer you were expecting, but it's like, it's kind of a little bit of everything. Like, he's just not that, he's not a particularly strong pocket quarterback. His legs are fantastic, but there's clearly a limitation to almost like every phase of him. You're like, yeah, he's like 80 cents less than, he's 60 cents on the dollar of like a Josh Allen. You know what I mean? Like, you see the skills, but you just don't see them at the level that you need them to be to win football games consistently.
Wait, are you talking about Justin Fields, or were you just talking about Daniel Jones? I can't tell which one you were actually talking about.
Yes. Is this way too similar to the Giants having Daniel Jones to talk about Justin Fields being the answer for them next season? That's a really good way to frame
it. This is why I'm out. If you were out on Daniel Jones, and much of the fan base was, how can you be in on Justin Fields? He is a guy that is an athlete that uses his legs, sometimes to a fault. He is considered inaccurate throwing the football. He's got 61% completion percentage, which is a problem. And his biggest knock was it's difficult for him to go through the read progression and get the ball to who is open and who needs to get it. And so, like, when you're thinking about what Brian Daboll wants, if Daniel Jones didn't work for this organization, why would Justin Fields? It's like the Spider-Man meme where they're pointing at each other. And so I point that out to say, I don't understand why people would want it. Now, if you tell me he's $5 million and he's a bridge and he's a veteran, as opposed to paying Daniel Jones 40, that's a different discussion point. But to actively want him on the roster based on his skill set and what his deficiencies are, just is a little bit strange to me.
I mean, his career numbers, he averages 155 passing yards per game, 61, as you mentioned, completion percentage. He's 14 and 30 as a starter. Matt, you know what's actually crazy? It seems like Justin Fields has been around, he's had injured, whatever. He's played 20 fewer games than Daniel Jones has as an NFL quarterback. So, look, there's just a lot of things there. Obviously, the rushing numbers, 400. They're actually about even in terms of rushes, 399 to 418, and he's rushed for about 400 more yards. But those legs, okay, that's all great, grand, and wonderful. But in the moments when you need it most, right, you need to be able to count on him to make that key throw. And this year, by the way, for what it's worth, yes, he completed 66% of his passes, 1,100 yards, right? 5 touchdowns, 1 pick. It's really just the fact that, yep, read the box score and you go, wow, pretty impressive. That's right. And he's not starting for the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? They went with the veteran, and you understand why with all the pedigree that Russell Wilson, even at this stage of his career, brings to the table. Okay, fine. We've got one more very sexy name to discuss. Before we talk about the others, there's some backups that are going to be around this weekend that could just be bridge options for the Giants. We want to run through those as well. But first and foremost, coming up next, what about that Sam? I was going to do it. You know what? I was going to do it. I was going to say Sam Bradford. Yeah, that's right. Think about it. Number 8 in your playbook, number 1 in your heart. I don't even know. Let's talk about Matt Stafford. Good Lord, in a second. Sam Bradford, Andy. Sam Bradford is who I wanted to talk about next. Matthew Stafford, we talked about this. I came up with the original thought about going after LaFleur from the LA Rams and bringing over Matt Stafford. At that point, Andrew maniacally transitioned into making it his own agenda and his own idea. Where do you stand on Matt Stafford? If it not only means paying him, obviously, the number's still going to be big. He's going to still make big money. He's still a very good quarterback at his age. And you may have to send something to LA to get him.
He is my number 1 choice if we are going for a veteran quarterback and you're expecting to win football games next year. I want to make that distinction very clear.
Caveat.
Like, if you need to win football games next year, Matt Stafford gives you the best opportunity to do that of any of these quarterbacks we're going to talk about, as well as any quarterback that you could get in the draft, specifically for next season, right? And so for me, I look at it, his contract is difficult knowing that you have Daniel Jones on there for a $22 million dead cap going into next season. But Matt Stafford has 2 more years on his deal. Yes, he will be in his age 37 season. He will have a $49 million and a $53 million cap hit over the next 2 seasons. That may feel cost prohibitive, but you have $0 allocated to the quarterback room in 2026. So you kind of look at it and say, all right, we're going to get a high draft pick here. We could bring Matt Stafford in. Maybe we give up a 3rd and a 4th for Matt Stafford. Like, what is the market value for a 37-year-old quarterback with 2 years left on his deal at that rate? I don't know. But what I will tell you is he is my number 1 choice far and away over any of these other ones. I'm willing to pay the premium because I think he makes the Giants competitive immediately. And I just keep having this vision of Matt Stafford throwing the ball to Malik Neighbors and seeing what he has done with guys like Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua and others. Like, to me, Matt Stafford is clearly the answer for the Giants. If the Rams want to say, hey, we got to reshuffle the deck, we got to restart over, let's start getting younger and get assets.
Easily the most insulting thing that has gone on around the NFL and that's happening on this podcast is us talking about the LA Rams being in the playoffs again. And we're sitting here being like, yeah, but like, maybe you don't want them anymore. Maybe you guys want to go younger. I don't know. Maybe this incredibly talented first ballot Hall of Famer, Super Bowl champion. Maybe you don't want him anymore.
They asked him to restructure. They asked him to restructure his deal. He said no. He's like, no, I don't want to play this game. And then all of a sudden there was like, well, he's saying no. And now Sean McVay is usually a guy that is ahead of the times. He brought over Baker Mayfield for a cup of coffee in a game that he had like no time to start. And maybe he turns around and says, it's time for us to sell out on Stafford a year early rather than a year late. And I'm the sucker that is the Giants fan that's like, we will take the year too late to be able to actually be slightly relevant. But again, maybe that's what good teams do over in Los Angeles. And maybe I'm the fool that wants to be,
We don't know. We don't know what good teams do, so it's hard. We gotta watch these other franchises. If it looks like they're doing something and it makes you scratch your head, assume that it's probably right relative to what the Giants have done. Okay, other backups here. Then, as we move into the backup really table of this, and options that I think we talk about is, listen, hey, you may say it's a make or break year and you got low patience, but let's also have a reality check. Maybe we're drafting a young quarterback. We want to have a bridge guy that can be moved out of the way relatively easy. You get Matthew Stafford. He's not going anywhere. You're going to have him as your starter, and you'd be elated to have that player. Two guys that I'm going to talk about here. One, actually in LA, is Jimmy Garoppolo. And then also you had mentioned about how Washington will be on the slate this weekend as well. Marcus Mariota is there. These two guys, like, they do feel kind of similar to me in a lot of ways. Injuries for Jimmy, but they've played 80 plus games. 67 completion percentage over for Jimmy, 63 for Mariota. Real quick, I view Jimmy Garoppolo as the better quarterback. Like, if I'm just, hey, who was a better quarterback? Jimmy Garoppolo is a better quarterback. And it doesn't take a lot for me to look at Jimmy, understanding the injuries. This isn't the perfect guy you want to go get. But I don't have a hard time looking at his stat lines when you only have to go back to 2022 in San Francisco. And we get it. His time ran out and they moved on. Awesome. He threw 16 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, right? Like, controls the game, 2,400 yards, nothing flashy, nothing sexy. Jimmy G seems like, for me, he might be that next name of guy that reclamates himself as a bridge starter for a couple of years. Like, I think he might be on that short list for me of guys that are capable of having a nice little renaissance for a season or two.
Listen, the thing with Jimmy Garoppolo for me is just the injury concerns that you mentioned before. Like, he always seems to get injured. And like, if the Giants don't improve the offensive line, he will inevitably be injured. I think the question, Adam, on the low-cost bridge quarterback, because this is a fascinating discussion, is what are you looking for? Are you looking for a bridge quarterback that can go out and win you a football game on any given Sunday? Are you looking for a guy that can tread water and make sure that if he has to start 6 games, can go 3-3 for your organization? Or are you looking for a talent that may have been discarded by another team where you're saying, like, the floor is much lower, but the ceiling could be significantly higher?
Sure. Yes, you're probably right. Because so to me, it's very easy to bring in Jimmy G. You draft your rookie quarterback and you say, Jimmy G's the starter. Jimmy G's starting the season. And when the time comes, we'll move on. When you look at Mariota, I think it'd be harder as you're working through camp to go, looks like he's getting outplayed. Probably time to maybe name the rookie the starter week 1. And then we get into these other guys, including out in Denver, maybe a Zach Wilson, right? Now they call these the flyer boys. You bring him in, there's no guarantee. You don't set any expectations of him being the starter. You just put him into the room and say, we're going to whether it's a draft pick, another veteran, maybe we go for 2 bodies, a watered down version of what Pittsburgh did. We're bringing in arms, we're throwing them in the mix, and whoever comes out, and that's fine for us for this year.
Yeah, to me, I think Zach Wilson, of all of the backup quarterbacks that are participating in the playoffs, is the one that I would want the most. Wow. And I'll tell you why, Adam. Wow. You look at Sam Darnold, who went and was completely dysfunctional with the New York Jets, spent like a cup of coffee with San Francisco and was like, oh, this is how like real organizations run. And then Kevin O'Connell's like, yeah, come over here. Like, we could figure this out together. And he has almost an MVP type season. Now, I'm not saying that's what happens with Zach Wilson, but what I'm saying is Zach Wilson is young, has all the traits of being a top 5 pick, was part of the tire fire that is the New York Jets last season, and has sat under Sean Payton and learned. He sat under Davis Webb and learned. Could you imagine if the Giants ended up hiring Davis Webb as their offensive coordinator and said, hey, you spent a year with Zach Wilson, why not come in and be able to have him compete with whichever rookie you want? It also makes it easy because, Adam, at that point, you could turn around and say, whichever one of these quarterbacks looks better in training camp is the starter, and you won't get any stink from anyone, right? It's like, if Cam Ward beats out Zach Wilson, well, he's the starter. If Zach Wilson looks more ready to play NFL football, you're like, perfect. We'll sit our rookie QB for 6 weeks until we think that he's ready to play. To me, he provides the most upside. Obviously, he has the lowest floor of any of these players. Like, maybe he's just not good. Yeah. But what are you looking for in your backup quarterback? It's not like you're the Kansas City Chiefs or someone else where you're like, if Mahomes goes down for a game, we absolutely need someone that can win 1 football game, but we don't expect him to play the rest of the season. We're talking about like, is this guy going to play meaningful snaps for the Giants in a season where we don't know what's going to happen?
I don't like it. Actually, I was gonna say I don't mind it. I don't like it. I don't want any part of. I don't want any part of Zach. Yeah, I don't want any part of Zach Wilson. I just think what's the no, just no. I say no. I'm not, and I don't. I'm not. It's not a bad argument that you're making, and it's age, and it's hey, pedigree. He was a top draft pick, right? So like you'll always side on the well. At some point, people agreed this kid could be something in the NFL. That should be enough. One of the guys I actually look. I look at Green Bay, and I say, hey, Malik Willis gets kind of they go and grab him from Tennessee, comes in, has to fill in for a little bit. I would like the idea of him. The reason I stopped short of really getting committed to the idea is because I think Green Bay is going to go, don't go anywhere. Why would you go somewhere? Like you've come here, you've played well. And maybe for Malik also, he's like, yes, I played well here. Like I have changed the narrative about who I am as a quarterback and whether or not I can be a viable option for a franchise. So like, I think it's more likely that he ends up being the guy that goes back to that spot, decent contract. They have obviously some injury concerns. Love got beat up this year, but I would put maybe Malik Willis into that group. And obviously we're going to, just as a heads up, we're going to talk about Kansas City. We're going to talk about Detroit, right? Hendon Hooker, Carson Wentz. These guys are all going to get discussed, but we're going to do that when we reach that round of the playoffs. So for me, yeah, Malik Willis, I think is very interesting. The reason why, by the way, that you and I agree, we don't talk about, or I should ask, do you agree? The reason why I don't bring up JJ McCarthy is because I don't understand the logic that people are talking about, that because Sam Darnold played well, you'll immediately get rid of the rookie quarterback that you just drafted and suffered an injury. The whole point of bringing in Sam Darnold was to have a bridge for JJ McCarthy. So you're going to blindly jettison the guy that's taking you to the playoffs, that threw 35 touchdowns. No, you're going to keep him, bring him back, sign him, franchise him, and you're going to let JJ keep learning and growing and recovering from injury. Like, I didn't get the logic of people being like, clearly time for Minnesota to trade away JJ McCarthy. Like, you just took him. And you clearly took him with the theory that you think he can be a franchise quarterback.
Yeah, so I maybe don't feel as strongly as you. JJ McCarthy is not a player that I'm like, he's off limits. He's off the table.
I'm not saying he's off limits, but
right?
But you, so like, I guess my thing on it is like, just because they got Sam Darnold and he played well, that doesn't change their opinion of JJ McCarthy. Like, from a Minnesota standpoint, we may not think that JJ is going to be that guy, but Minnesota thought highly enough of him to take him as a top 10, a top pick. Like, so you have to have some belief that he's going to get there.
Well, it's a $9 million dead cap hit if they were to trade him, so they actually would lose money. But the whole thing is, let's just say a QB needy team that is drafting in the top 3. Let's say it's even the Giants. Yeah. They offer their second round pick, which is the number 2 overall pick in the second round for JJ McCarthy. If the Vikings say, Sam, we are committed to Sam Darnold, we signed him to a long-term deal, we could bring Daniel Jones back. Let's reallocate resources to make our team better. And perhaps there's a safety or a corner or an offensive tackle that we want in the second round that makes us better tomorrow, but not necessarily as deep as we are at certain positions. It feels like they have a plethora of quarterbacks. So for me, like, I think they should at least find out what his value is around the league. You can get a second round pick for him and you're going to sign Sam Darnold anyway. To me, that seems like coming off of a knee injury, not playing an NFL game. You already have your quarterback, go reallocate the funds. But again, that's predicated on other teams wanting him and him having that value to them.
Yeah, I guess. And it's like the injury is a part of it, but okay, hasn't even stepped on the football field, and suddenly he's gone from top 10 pick value to being a second rounder. You're going to give that only a second rounder to come get him. I just that's the part that I don't get. I think you'd be having, if you're the Vikings and you're considering it, quote unquote, I'm considering. So didn't get a quarterback at the top of the draft, got something in the middle of the first round. Let's have a conversation. I'm not taking a second round pick, even at the top end of it, to give up a guy that I just drafted. Like, my belief in him is at least has to be strong enough that you're going to have to pull him away from me, not me saying Darnold's great, let's go ahead and move on. And like you say, the Daniel Jones angle is interesting, but it does. All of a sudden they turn around and they go, so we have Sam Darnold and Daniel Jones. What's our future look like if Sam Darnold has a mediocre year next year? Well, I guess we'll see. We'll still be a good team, probably make the playoffs, won't be near the top of the draft. You always want to hold on to these guys, at least in my mind. But ultimately, when we look back at this, Andy, I think you and I both agree, depending on the price, but Darnold's not going to be available in our eyes. Stafford is very interesting. If you're telling me win now, then I think the Giants should seriously, if the Rams are really open to discussions, the Giants should be one of the first teams that has that conversation, whether or not they end up being the partner that fits. After that, you and I are not terribly excited about Justin Fields. I think Garoppolo falls into the like decent bridge area, maybe Malik Willis, and we'll have some guys to talk about next week. It's interesting, man. This is kind of going to be a funky offseason for how the Giants construct this QB room. I think that's at least in this weekend slate of games. That's what I come away with. I don't think we're shy of Stafford and like going all in. I think anyone the Giants sign, we're going to go, okay, what does that look like based on what John Mara said he expects for the upcoming year, not about what we think would be a decent season or help them usher in the next era at the QB position.
At the end of the day, the interesting thing about this is Tommy DeVito is the only quarterback that is in the room. So it feels basically like a blank canvas. You can go a whole host of different ways on this. It's not like you have the established backup and you have to go get your quarterback of the future. It's not, oh, we have Daniel Jones, let's go get Drew Lock as his backup now. It's literally, you can figure this and configure it any way that you want. So, obviously Garoppolo is a veteran QB that you mentioned. I kind of like the idea of Zach Wilson, especially if it's okay if the bottom falls out anyway on this team.
Sure.
But I think we both agree. Yeah. A guy like Matt Stafford would change the direction of the franchise very quickly. But yeah, this is going to be a wild offseason for the Giants because every single consideration should be on the table.
100%. And as we work through next week, we'll get Carson Wentz, that conversation. We'll get Hendon Hooker in that conversation. But then we also have a lot of guys. Andy is going to want to talk about Jacoby Brissett. Like, come on. Let's be realistic, guys. If you follow the podcast, he's going to want to talk about him. I may even want to talk about Andy Dalton. Like, there are just a lot of, hey, second, third tier kind of guys. Taylor Heineke is going to be playing this weekend. We don't talk about him because anyone really that excited about it. But this is the discussion to me. And I think you're right. If you take away expectations for next year, how do you just make an interesting QB room where you get sample sizes on guys and you see who takes the reins and you throw maybe a rookie into that mix? The way that this organization runs itself makes it impossible to know how they're going to attack this QB room. And short of saying they haven't done a great job of late. So it doesn't build you with confidence that Joe Shane is going to be the key decision maker about what this room looks like. They gave you Daniel Jones, Drew Lock, and Tommy DeVito last year, and they released Daniel Jones, and they waited a while before they started Drew Lock. We don't know. But enjoy the football this weekend, guys. We'll go ahead and put out on social our picks going into this weekend. We probably should have done a little bit of that here. Maybe a little bonus content coming out over the weekend in that regard. Until next time, though, man, you get us on YouTube. Sit back. There's no pressure. Watch some free agents at all the positions. You get us over on the podcast feed on X at AMAC214, at Adam Armick, and at One Giant Podcast. Baby, there's no pressure. Go and enjoy it. But until next time, until those best times, as Andrew Mackowitz would want, need, and nay, demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.